Drive south from Trinidad, Colorado, along Interstate 25, through the high desert where the Rocky Mountains begin their slow descent into New Mexico. The landscape is austere: scrub grass, red rock, distant mesas under an enormous sky. Pull off at exit 27 and you'll find yourself on a dirt road leading to what looks like an empty field. But this is not just an empty field. There's a monument here, granite and bronze, erected by the United Mine Workers of America, inscribed with names: Louis Ticas, Cedilia Costa, 11 children whose names are carved into stone. Beyond the monument there are depressions in the earth, outlines of where structures once stood, foundations buried under decades of soil and grass. This is Ludlow. Or rather, this is what remains of Ludlow. In 1913, this was a tent colony housing over 1,000 people, striking coal miners and their families, evicted from company towns, living in canvas shelters through a Colorado winter. They were here because they believed in something radical for their time, that workers deserved fair wages, safe conditions, the right to organize. They were here because the coal companies that controlled southern Colorado refused to grant them those things. And on April 20th, 1914, the Colorado National Guard and company-hired gunmen attacked this camp. They fired machine guns into the tents. They set the colony on fire. When it was over, at least 21 people were dead, including 2 women and 11 children who suffocated in a pit beneath a burning tent. The Ludlow Massacre, as it came to be known, was one of the deadliest incidents of labor violence in American history. But Ludlow itself, the place, the community, the coal mining region that produced the conflict, that story is largely forgotten. How does a railroad and mining hub that fueled Colorado's development become a field of grass and a memorial? What forces created Ludlow, destroyed it, and then erased it from memory? And what does it say about America that we built monuments to the dead, but forgot why they died? If you enjoy deep investigations into America's forgotten cities, ghost towns, and lost empires, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which place to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. To understand Ludlow, you have to understand southern Colorado in the late 19th century. This was borderland, the edge where the Great Plains met the Rockies, where Spanish and Anglo cultures collided, where cattle ranching gave way to something more profitable: coal. Beneath the mesas and valleys of Las Animas and Huerfano counties, there was coal. Lots of it. High-quality bituminous coal, perfect for powering locomotives, heating homes, feeding the steel furnaces of a rapidly industrializing America. Geologists estimated hundreds of millions of tons, easily accessible through horizontal tunnels cut into the hillsides. The railroads arrived first. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway, the Colorado and Southern, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, they all pushed lines through southern Colorado in the 1870s and 1880s, connecting Denver to the southwest, opening routes to California and Texas. And railroads needed coal, enormous quantities of it. So the coal companies came. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was the largest, eventually controlling most of southern Colorado's coal production. CF&I, as it was known, was backed by some of the wealthiest men in America. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron, the richest man in the world, bought a controlling interest in the company. Rockefeller never visited the Colorado coal fields. He never saw the mines, never met the miners, never walked through the company towns his corporation controlled. But his money shaped every aspect of life in places like Ludlow, Berwind, Hastings, Tabasco, Primero, the string of mining camps that dotted the foothills. The business model was simple and brutally effective. CF&I would buy land with coal deposits. They would sink mines, tunnels driven horizontally into the hillsides following the coal seams. They would build company towns near the mines, rows of identical wooden houses, a company store, a school, maybe a church. They would recruit workers, mostly immigrants, to extract the coal, and they would control every aspect of those workers' lives. This wasn't just mining. This was total economic capture. The coal camps of southern Colorado, were not towns in any normal sense. They were industrial facilities designed to extract coal as efficiently as possible, and the workers were simply one more component of that machinery. CF&I and the other coal companies built dozens of these camps throughout the region. Ludlow itself wasn't a camp. It was a railroad stop, a depot where the Colorado and Southern Railway intersected with the main north-south line. But it sat in the heart of coal country, surrounded by mines and camps. Berwyn to the west, Hastings to the north, Tabasco and Primero beyond that. The camps themselves were remarkably similar. Identical wooden houses, painted the same colors, arranged in identical rows. No running water in most of them. Workers hauled water from wells or streams. No electricity in the early years. Outhouses instead of indoor plumbing. Coal stoves for heat. Ironic given that the men were mining coal all day. The quality of housing depended on your position. Mine foremen and superintendents got better houses, sometimes even separate from the main camp. Skilled workers, mechanics, blacksmiths, engineers, got decent cottages. The miners themselves, the men who actually went underground, often lived in the smallest, most crowded structures. Immigrant families frequently packed multiple generations into 2 or 3 rooms. And then there was the company store. In most camps, there was no alternative. The company store sold everything: food, clothes, tools, medicine. Prices were high, often significantly higher than in independent stores in Trinidad or Walsenburg. But miners were paid in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at company stores. Some camps literally had no cash economy. Everything ran on scrip, ensuring that money flowed from the workers' labor directly back to the company. The work itself was extraordinarily dangerous. Colorado's coal mines were particularly prone to methane gas buildup. Ventilation was often inadequate. Mine timbers, the wooden supports holding up the tunnel ceilings, were frequently reused long past the point of safety. Explosions were common. Cave-ins were expected. Between 1884 and 1912, over 700 miners died in Colorado coal mines. The miners worked long shifts, often 10 to 12 hours, in cramped tunnels, breathing coal dust, always aware that a spark, a crack in the timber, or a pocket of gas could kill them instantly. They were paid by the ton of coal they extracted, not by the hour, which meant they bore the risk of working in dangerous or unproductive areas. If the coal seam was thin, if the rock was hard, if conditions slowed them down, they earned less while working just as hard. And they could be fired for almost anything. Complaining about safety, joining a union, even shopping at a store in town instead of the company store. To staff their mines, the coal companies recruited from across the world. Southern and Eastern Europeans primarily, Italians, Greeks, Slavs, Poles, Japanese immigrants, Mexican workers from across the border. A smaller number of English, Welsh, and Scots often placed in supervisory positions because they spoke English and had mining experience. By 1910, over 15,000 people worked in the southern Colorado coalfields. The population was staggeringly diverse, at least 30 different nationalities speaking 20 different languages. In some camps, entire neighborhoods were organized by ethnicity: Greek Town, Italian Row, Mexican Hill. The companies exploited these divisions deliberately. They paid different ethnic groups different wages for the same work. They housed different groups separately. They promoted some ethnicities over others, creating resentment and preventing solidarity. If Italian miners started organizing, the company would hire more Greeks. If Greek workers complained, the company would bring in Mexicans willing to work for less. But despite the company's efforts to divide them, the miners began to organize. The United Mine Workers of America had been trying to unionize Colorado since the 1890s. They had some success in northern Colorado but struggled in the south, where CF&I's control was absolute. Organizers who came to the coal camps were fired immediately. Workers suspected of union sympathies were evicted from company housing and blacklisted, making it impossible to find work anywhere in the region. Still, discontent grew. By 1913, conditions in the camps had become intolerable for many workers. Safety violations were endemic. Pay was shrinking as companies found new ways to cheat miners, charging them for tools, for coal car repairs, for using inferior scales that underweighed their production. Company guards, employed by the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, patrolled the camps with rifles, intimidating workers, breaking up any gatherings that looked like organizing. In September 1913, the United Mine Workers called a strike. The strike was massive. Over 11,000 miners walked off the job. It was also immediately met with eviction. The coal companies owned the houses, and they wasted no time. Families were given hours to pack their belongings and leave. In some camps, company guards physically threw people's possessions into the streets. The Union had prepared for this. They had secured land just outside company property, public land and private land leased from sympathetic ranchers. Near Ludlow, at the railroad crossing, they established the largest tent colony. It was a city of canvas. The Union provided tents, large family tents for married miners and their families, smaller tents for single men. They dug latrines, organized water distribution, set up a field kitchen. Within days, over 1,000 people were living in the Ludlow colony. Similar colonies sprang up at Walsenburg, Forbes, and other locations throughout the coal fields. Life in the tent colony was difficult, especially as winter approached. Colorado winters at 6,000 feet elevation are harsh. Temperatures dropping below zero, snow piling up, wind that cut through canvas like it wasn't there. Families huddled around small stoves. Children got sick. Food was limited to what the Union could provide and what families could buy with their dwindling savings. But there was also something remarkable happening. The tent colony became a multi-ethnic community, in a way the segregated company camps never had been. Greek families lived next to Italian families next to Mexican families. They shared food, watched each other's children, organized entertainment, dances, concerts, storytelling. Louis Tikas, a Greek immigrant who had worked in the mines for years, emerged as a leader, mediating between different groups, keeping morale up, organizing the colony's defense. Because defense was necessary, the coal companies were not going to let the strike succeed without a fight. CF&I and the other coal companies had enormous resources and powerful political connections. They hired the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency to break the strike. Baldwin-Felts was notorious, essentially a private army that specialized in breaking unions. They brought in armed guards, built an armored car mounted with a machine gun, strikers called it the Death Special, and began patrolling the roads around the tent colonies, firing into the camps at night, intimidating anyone who tried to leave. The state government, controlled by politicians friendly to the coal companies, deployed the Colorado National Guard to the coal fields in October 1913. Officially, the Guard was there to keep the peace. In reality, they acted as an extension of company power. Officers openly socialized with mine superintendents. Guardsmen harassed strikers, arrested union organizers on dubious charges, protected strikebreakers brought in to work the mines. As winter deepened, the situation became a siege. Strikers couldn't work, but they also couldn't give up. They'd lost their homes, their jobs, and admitting defeat meant destitution. The companies couldn't restart full production without their experienced miners, but they wouldn't negotiate with the union. To do so would mean recognizing workers' right to organize, which they refused on principle. Violence escalated. There were shootings. Strikers ambushed company guards. Guards fired into tent colonies. In late 1913, a private detective was killed. In early 1914, a young striker was shot by guards. Each incident hardened positions, made compromise less likely. By April 1914, the National Guard had been in the coal fields for 6 months. The state couldn't afford to maintain them indefinitely. The Guard began withdrawing, replaced by a smaller militia force made up largely of mine guards deputized as soldiers. These were not neutral peacekeepers, they were company employees in military uniforms. The stage was set for disaster. Easter was late in 1914, April 12th. The tent colony at Ludlow had celebrated together, a brief moment of normalcy. The following week was tense. Militia patrols increased. There were rumors that the companies were planning something. On Monday, April 20th, the day began normally. Children played in the spring sun, women cooked breakfast, men organized picket shifts, Then, around 10 a.m., the militia moved into position on a ridge overlooking the colony. They set up machine guns. What happened next is disputed in its details, but clear in its outcome. Someone fired a shot. Whether it came from the militia or from armed strikers defending the colony is still debated. But once shooting started, it didn't stop. The militia opened up with machine guns, raking the tents with bullets. Strikers returned fire. Families dove into pits they had dug beneath their tents. Crude shelters meant to protect them from exactly this kind of attack. The shooting continued for hours. At some point, the militia moved down from the ridge and entered the colony. They set fire to the tents. The canvas, dried by the sun and wind, burned quickly. Black smoke rose over the prairie. Louis Tikas, the Greek strike leader, tried to negotiate a ceasefire. Accounts suggest he was either captured or surrendered. What is certain is that he was shot in the back, execution style, and his body was left in a ditch. When the fires finally burned out and the shooting stopped, rescuers searching through the ruins found a pit beneath one of the tents. Inside were 2 women and 11 children, dead from smoke inhalation. They had hidden from the bullets only to be trapped when the tent above them caught fire. The final death toll was at least 21, though some historians believe it was higher. Some bodies may never have been found, and the chaos of the day made accurate counting impossible. News of the massacre spread rapidly. Across the coalfields, miners armed themselves. They raided company gun stores, broke into arsenals, organized into militias. What followed was called the 10 Days War, an armed insurrection against the coal companies and the state. Miners attacked company property, burning buildings, destroying equipment. They fought gun battles with company guards and militia forces. They seized control of several coal camps, forcing mine superintendents and guards to flee. The violence spread across southern Colorado, Berwind, Hastings, Delagua, Tabasco. For 10 days, parts of Colorado were in open rebellion. The state government, overwhelmed, asked President Woodrow Wilson for help. On April 30th, federal troops arrived, U.S. Army cavalry and infantry. Unlike the National Guard, the federal troops were neutral. They disarmed both sides, restored order, and stopped the killing. The strike continued for several more months, but the massacre had broken its momentum. Strikers were exhausted, traumatized, and facing overwhelming force. The Union was running out of money. By December 1914, the strike was called off. The miners had lost. The immediate aftermath of Ludlow was legal confusion and political maneuvering. Investigations were launched. Hearings were held. Reports were written. The military officers who commanded the militia during the massacre were investigated but never prosecuted. John D. Rockefeller was called to testify before Congress. He expressed regret for the deaths but denied any direct responsibility. He'd never even been to Colorado, he pointed out, and had trusted his managers to handle labor relations appropriately. The bodies of the victims were buried. The tent colony was never rebuilt. The strikers who survived scattered. Some returned to mining when they could find work. Some left Colorado entirely, moving to Wyoming, New Mexico, California, anywhere they might start over. But Ludlow changed something in American consciousness. The image of women and children burned to death in a tent colony, killed by militia forces serving corporate interests, was too stark to ignore. Progressive politicians used Ludlow as evidence that corporate power had become too concentrated, too brutal. Labor organizers used it to rally support for unions. Socialists and radicals pointed to it as proof that capitalism, left unchecked, would sacrifice human lives for profit. John D. Rockefeller, stung by the negative publicity, hired public relations experts to rehabilitate his image. He created company unions, worker organizations controlled by management, to give the appearance of worker representation without actual power. He donated enormous sums to charity, building libraries, funding universities, supporting medical research. The Rockefeller name became associated with philanthropy rather than Ludlow. The coal camps themselves continued operating for decades. CF&I remained the dominant employer in southern Colorado. Conditions improved somewhat, partly due to the negative publicity from Ludlow, partly due to new mine safety regulations. But the fundamental structure remained: company towns, company stores, workers with limited power. The decline of southern Colorado's coal industry was gradual, unlike the sudden violence that had defined Ludlow. Over the following decades, the economic forces that had created the coal camps slowly made them obsolete. Natural gas began replacing coal for heating. Oil became the dominant transportation fuel. Diesel locomotives replaced coal-burning engines. The steel industry, which had consumed enormous quantities of coking coal, moved to locations with cheaper labor and better access to iron ore. CF&I continued operating, but at reduced capacity. The company closed some mines, consolidated others. The coal camps, no longer needed to house workers, were gradually abandoned. Berwind, Hastings, Tabasco, Primero, one by one they emptied out. Houses were torn down or left to collapse. Company stores closed, schools shut down. Ludlow itself, never a mining camp but a railroad stop and the site of the tent colony, faded even faster. The railroad reduced service. The depot closed. By the 1950s, there was almost nothing left. The land where the tent colony had stood was just a field again. Grass grew over the foundations. Wind erased the paths. If you didn't know what had happened there, you'd drive right past. In 1918, the United Mine Workers erected a monument at the site of the massacre. It was a statement. This happened here, and we will not forget. Over the decades, the monument became the only physical reminder of Ludlow. The Union maintained it, held commemorations there, kept the memory alive in labor circles. But for most Americans, Ludlow faded from memory. It wasn't taught in schools. It didn't appear in most history textbooks. When people thought of Colorado, they thought of skiing, of mountains, of natural beauty, not of labor massacres and burned tent colonies. In the 1960s and 1970s, historians rediscovered Ludlow. Academic books were written, documentaries were made. Woody Guthrie had written songs about it decades earlier, and now folk singers revived them. The monument became a pilgrimage site for labor activists, a place to remember what workers had fought for, what they'd lost. In 2009, the site was designated a National Historic Landmark. The state of Colorado officially recognized the massacre's significance. Tours are now offered. Information plaques explain what happened. The site receives a few thousand visitors per year: labor historians, activists, school groups, tourists interested in dark history. But the coal camps themselves are gone. Berwind is a collection of ruins, mostly on private property. Hastings has a few buildings left, slowly collapsing. Tabasco and Primero are names on old maps, nothing more. The entire infrastructure of southern Colorado's coal industry has been erased, not by violence this time, but by time and economics. Stand at the Ludlow Monument today, on a windy spring afternoon, and try to imagine what this field looked like in April 1914. Try to imagine over 1,000 people living here in tents, children playing between the rows, women cooking over open fires, men standing guard against militia attacks. It's difficult. The landscape gives no clues. The field is empty, peaceful. The only sounds are wind and the occasional truck on the interstate in the distance. The Rocky Mountains rise to the west, exactly as they did in 1914, indifferent to human drama. The monument stands, granite and bronze, the names carved deep. But monuments raise as many questions as they answer. We mark where people died, but do we understand why they died? We remember the massacre, but do we remember the system that produced it? Southern Colorado's coal industry was built on the same principles that created company towns across America. The belief that capital has the right to organize labor however it sees fit, that workers are simply factors of production, that communities exist to serve economic extraction. The workers at Ludlow were striking for basic demands: an 8-hour workday, the right to choose where they shopped, the right to organize without being fired, enforcement of existing safety laws. These weren't radical demands. They were asking to be treated as human beings rather than disposable machinery. And they were met with eviction, starvation, machine gun fire, and arson. Ludlow is not unique. It's the most dramatic, the most deadly, but it's part of a pattern that repeated across American industrial history. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago, 1886, workers striking for an 8-hour day, police violence, a bombing, executions. The Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania, 1892, steelworkers fighting wage cuts, Pinkerton guards attacking the mill, deaths on both sides. The Pullman Strike of 1894, railroad workers protesting wage reductions, federal troops deployed to break the strike. The Paint Creek Cabin Creek Strike in West Virginia, 1912-1913, coal miners fighting for union recognition. Mine guards shooting into tent colonies, a year of violence. The list goes on. Across America, whenever workers organized to challenge corporate power, they faced overwhelming force, company guards, state militia, federal troops. The violence wasn't random. It was a tool, used deliberately to maintain a system where capital controlled labor, absolutely. What makes Ludlow particularly haunting is not just the body count, but who died. 11 children, 2 women. They weren't fighting. They weren't armed. They were hiding in a hole in the ground, trying to survive, and they suffocated when the militia set fire to their shelter. That image, children dying in a pit while men in uniform stood above, captures something essential about how power operates. The people making decisions, Rockefeller in New York, the executives in Denver, the politicians in Washington, were far removed from the consequences. They never saw the burned tent. They never smelled the smoke. They never heard the children coughing. They just saw balance sheets, and those balance sheets said that giving in to workers' demands would reduce profits. So they didn't give in. And when workers wouldn't back down, force was applied. The fact that children died was, from their perspective, unfortunate but ultimately irrelevant to the economic question. There's a question that Ludlow asks, quietly but persistently. Has anything fundamental changed? We don't have company towns anymore, not in the same explicit way. Workers aren't paid in scrip. They can shop where they want, live where they want. Unions exist, with legal protections. There are minimum wage laws, safety regulations, workers' compensation. All of these improvements came from struggles like Ludlow, from workers willing to strike, to face violence, to die if necessary. Every labor protection we take for granted was won through conflict, but the underlying structure remains. Capital is still mobile, workers are still trapped by geography and need. Corporations still treat workers as costs to be minimized. Communities still rise and fall based on economic decisions made by people who never have to live with the consequences. We don't call them company towns anymore. We call them single industry communities or economically depressed regions, or we don't call them anything at all. We just drive past them on the interstate, wondering why the houses look so run down, why the streets are empty. And when those communities collapse, when the factory closes, when the mine shuts down, when the corporation decides it can make more profit somewhere else, we don't call it a massacre. We call it market forces, creative destruction, economic restructuring. The language is softer, but the result is the same. Communities built to serve capital, discarded when they're no longer profitable. The wind blows across the field at Ludlow. The monument stands silent. The names of the dead remain carved in stone, permanent in a way their lives never were. This was a place where over 1,000 people tried to build something better. Not a utopia, not a revolution, just better working conditions, fair wages, the right to organize. They lived in tents through a Colorado winter to fight for those things, and they were attacked with machine guns and burned alive for daring to ask. Most of them are forgotten now. We remember the massacre vaguely, as a dramatic event in labor history. But the people, their names, their faces, their individual stories, are lost. Louis Ticas, shot in the back, is just a name on a monument. Cedilia Costa and her children, who died in the pit, are statistics in a history book. The coal is still in the ground, most of it. No one mines it anymore because it's not economical. The camps are gone. The railroads are mostly abandoned. The entire economic system that created Ludlow and then destroyed it has moved on. leaving nothing but ruins and questions. And the central question remains, what do we owe each other? What does capital owe to labor? What do corporations owe to the communities they build and abandon? What does a society owe to the people who do its most difficult, dangerous work? Ludlow forces us to confront these questions, not because it offers answers, it doesn't, but because it shows, in the starkest possible terms, what happens when we treat those questions as irrelevant, when we decide that only profit matters, when we organize society around the principle that capital must be free to do whatever maximizes returns. The bodies of children burned to death in a pit are what that principle looks like when taken to its logical conclusion. Places like this are not just ruins. They're questions we keep asking and rarely answer honestly. If you'd like to see more stories like this, deep investigations into America's forgotten industrial conflicts, abandoned communities, and the workers written out of our history, please like this video, subscribe to Forgotten America Stories, and tell me in the comments which forgotten place I should explore next. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible.